The camera caught her at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. My son's wife, alone in my shop, standing over the display case with her phone in one hand and my late wife's watch in the other. She turned it over. She pressed the clasp. She held it up to the light and studied the back, the way a person studies something when they know exactly what they are looking for. She did not find it. But I found her. And what my wife Lorraine had hidden inside that watch 9 years ago was about to end everything Vanessa had spent 3 years building. I am grateful you are here. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from, city, country. I want to know. Some elements of this story have been shaped for narrative and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or places is coincidental. But everything I am sharing with you is worth hearing. The last customer left at 5:20 and by 5:30 I was alone again, the way I had been alone every evening for the past 6 years. I did not mind it the way people assumed I minded it. Solitude in a place you have occupied for 39 years takes on a different quality than solitude elsewhere. The shop had its own sounds at closing time. The tick of the jeweler's lamp cooling, the faint creak of the glass display cases settling against their brass hinges, the occasional car passing on Broughton Street outside with the particular hiss of tires on damp autumn pavement. I knew all of it. The way you know the breathing of a house you have lived in long enough to stop hearing it consciously. I turned the sign from open to closed and stood for a moment looking out through the front glass at Broughton Street in the early dark. October in Savannah does not come down fast the way it does in the northern states. It arrives sideways. A slow change in the angle of the light. The Spanish moss on the live oaks, catching the street lamps differently than it did in September. Turning from silver green to something closer to amber. The air was still warm enough to leave the door cracked, but I did not leave the door cracked. I had stopped leaving it cracked 18 months ago. For reasons that will become clear. The shop smelled the way it always smelled. Clock oil, old wood. The faint metallic trace of brass polish that had soaked into the workbench surface so long ago that no amount of cleaning would remove it. Lorraine used to say the shop smelled like patience. I think she was right, though, at the time. I told her it smelled like a living. She had hung the linen curtains on the south window in 1991, pale blue with brass rings from a shop on River Street that has since closed. They threw particular bands of light across the repair bench on sunny mornings, soft and evenly spaced. The kind of light that made the work easier without you noticing it was helping. I had never taken them down. There had never been a reason good enough. The last customer that evening had been a man in his late 70s. Thin white hair combed carefully to one side. A good jacket, the kind that has been restitched at the elbows more than once because throwing it away was never considered. He carried a pocket watch in both hands. A Hamilton from 1942, military issue. The kind they gave to railwaymen and officers who needed something that would not lie to them about the time. His father had carried it through the Pacific. It had stopped running sometime in the spring, and he had carried it in his jacket pocket every day since, the way people carry things that have stopped working but have not stopped mattering. I examined the watch while he sat in the customer chair. The mechanism was familiar. A worn mainspring. Tension reduced below the threshold needed to drive the escapement through a full cycle. The kind of repair that requires patience rather than complexity. I worked in silence for 40 minutes. He sat with his hands folded and watched me, or looked out the window, or both at once, the way customers sometimes do when they are not really watching the work, but watching the fact that someone is taking care of something they love. When I set the Hamilton on the counter and wound the crown and held it to his ear so he could hear the movement running true again, he closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. The length of time it takes a clock to complete one full tick. Then he opened them and nodded once. "How long have you done this?" he asked. 39 years, I said. Long enough to know the difference between a clock that is broken and a clock that is waiting. He looked at me when I said that. Then he looked at the Hamilton in my hands. He paid what I asked, without negotiating. People rarely negotiated in this shop, which I had always taken as a sign that they understood what they were actually paying for. He left at 5:20, with the watch held carefully against his coat. the same careful grip he had carried it in with. I stood at the window and watched him walk east along Broughton toward the parking structure on Bull Street until he turned the corner beneath the live oaks and was gone. Then I turned back to the shop. In the corner of the glass display case, on a square of dark blue velvet, sat the Patek Philippe. Gold case, manual wind, made in Geneva in 1948. The year my wife's father was beginning his second year as associate pastor at the First Baptist Church on Bull Street, a position he would hold and grow into for the next 23 years until it became as much a part of him as his own name. The watch had come to me through Lorraine, brought to the bench on a Saturday afternoon in the summer of 2016, held with the careful deliberateness of someone carrying something she had waited 15 years to touch. I had kept it there ever since, in the place that seemed most natural for it, which was also the place where it was visible every day, and where I never quite managed to look at it directly. I had never repaired it. There was nothing to repair. The Patek Philippe was in better condition than most timepieces I received that had been worn and maintained carefully for their entire lives. I had never sold it, though I had been offered reasonable prices twice. I had kept it because it had seemed from the first day it sat on that velvet square like something that was waiting rather than abandoned. I picked it up. I held it the way I held it every evening, not examining it, not inspecting it, just holding it. The way you hold something that connects you to a time and a person and a set of circumstances that you are still, after 6 years, in the process of understanding. I lit the small candle on the far corner of the bench, a habit I had started the week after Lorraine died without deciding to start it. The way certain habits arrive not through intention, but through necessity. Then I sat down on the stool and held the Patek Philippe in the amber light and the quiet of the closed shop. I had never thought a watch could save a man's life. But 6 years ago, my wife left one behind, and it did exactly that. To understand what Lorraine left behind, you have to understand who she was, and why the summer of 2016 was the last summer we ever had together. Most people, when they think about a person they have lost, start with the big things. The wedding, the children, the years. I have done that too, in the quiet hours when the shop is closed and the candle has burned down to almost nothing. But when I think about Lorraine, really think about her, I always come back to small things first. The way she corrected sheet music at the kitchen table with a pencil she kept behind her ear, the eraser end worn nearly flat from 24 years of second thoughts about tempo markings. The way she always knew when a student was struggling before the student knew it themselves, not from the notes they played but from the way they held the instrument. The way she laughed, starting somewhere deep in her chest and arriving at her face last, as though her body needed to approve it before her expression was allowed to show it. 24 years in a music classroom on Habersham Street in Savannah will give a person a particular kind of patience, and Lorraine had it in abundance. She applied it to everything. Difficult students, difficult parents, school administrators who believed that music education was a luxury rather than a necessity, and one difficult watchmaker who sometimes forgot that not everything needed to be taken apart to be understood. She taught strings and woodwinds and general music appreciation to 6th through 8th graders in the same building, where Nathan had been a student and then later a name the younger teachers recognized from old concert programs pinned the corkboard in the faculty lounge. She was 56 years old when the doctors in Savannah gave us the diagnosis. Lung cancer, stage 4. The kind of news that arrives in a hospital room and rearranges everything in the world outside it. She had never smoked a day in her life. The oncologist said that, with a kind of careful neutrality, as though the unfairness of it was a clinical detail rather than the central fact of the situation. They gave her somewhere between 4 and 7 months. Lorraine listened to all of it carefully, the way she listened to everything, her whole face engaged, her hands still in her lap. Then she asked 2 questions. The first was practical. Something about treatment schedules that I have since forgotten, because the mind protects itself by letting go of the logistics and holding on to the moments that mattered. The second was this: what is the best way to spend the time I have left? The doctor looked surprised by the question. I was not. That was Lorraine. She had spent 24 years teaching children that music was not about perfection but about deciding what to do with the time between the notes. We drove home in the kind of silence that has nothing to do with peace. I remember the way the light looked on the Savannah River as we crossed the Talmadge Bridge, flat and silver gray, the water moving beneath us with the slow patience of something that has been moving in the same direction for longer than anyone on the bridge has been alive. The marshes on either side were beginning to turn, that particular gold green of early autumn in the Georgia low country, when the Spartina grass catches the late afternoon light and holds it the way a cupped hand holds water, briefly and beautifully before it runs through. Lorraine sat, with her hands folded, and looked out the passenger window. She did not cry. She would cry later, privately. In the room at the end of the hall where she kept her music stand and the framed photograph of her father. But on the bridge she was quiet, and I understood the quiet. It was the quiet of a woman who was already making a plan. She told me one evening on the back porch of our house on Broughton Street, while the fireflies were beginning their slow circuits above the garden and the magnolia tree at the far corner of the yard was holding the last of the June light in its upper branches. She said she wanted to learn how watches worked. Not to become a horologist, not to repair them, just to understand. To finally close the distance between herself and something her father had loved before she no longer had the chance. Her father, Reverend James Whitfield, had been the senior pastor at First Baptist Church on Bull Street for 23 years, from 1951 until his death in 1971. He was a careful man, deliberate in his movements, precise in his language, the kind of pastor who prepared his sermons the way a watchmaker prepares a mechanism, every word tested for weight and balance before it was allowed into the assembly. He had one private indulgence. He loved timepieces, not as a collector, not with acquisitive hunger, but with the genuine curiosity of a person who believed that understanding how a thing worked was a form of respect for the mind that made it. He carried one watch his entire adult life, a Patek Philippe, gold case, manual wind, made in Geneva, in 1948. He had saved for it over 3 years on a pastoral salary, with the discipline of a man raised during the Depression who understood that the difference between a want and a need was not the object itself, but the reason you reached for it. He told Lorraine once, she was perhaps 10 years old, that he had chosen that watch because it ran on nothing but the energy stored in a coiled spring and released through gears so precisely made that they could measure the passage of a day to within 2 seconds. No battery, no electricity, just the accumulated tension of a wound spring, released at a rate governed by the balance wheel, which oscillated 21,600 times per hour, with a regularity he found, in his word, holy. He died of a heart attack on a Sunday morning in February of 1971. He was 58 years old. Lorraine was 14. She told me once that she remembered almost nothing about the days immediately after, just the particular quality of stillness in the house, and the way his watch sat on the dresser for months before anyone moved it. The ticking had stopped. No one wounded it, and the silence where the ticking had been was louder than any sound she had heard before or since. The Patek Philippe passed to Lorraine's mother, Eleanor, who kept it in a velvet-lined box on the top shelf of her closet and never once opened it in the 27 years she outlived her husband. When Eleanor died in 2001, it came to Lorraine. She placed it in the same velvet box on the top shelf of the bedroom closet in our house on Broughton Street and kept it there for 15 years. She never opened the case. She never wounded it. I asked her once, early in our marriage, whether she wanted me to service it. She said no. She said she was not ready. I did not ask what she meant by that, and I did not ask again. That was not the mistake. The mistake came later. The watch arrived at my shop on a Saturday afternoon in late June of 2016, 3 weeks after the diagnosis. Lorraine set the Patek Philippe on the repair bench between us, the way you set down something that has traveled a very long distance to arrive at exactly this spot. She did not slide it or place it casually. She held it in both hands and lowered it onto the wood with the particular care of someone transporting something irreplaceable, which in every sense that mattered it was. "Teach me how it works," she said. "I want to understand what my father loved." I should tell you something about the Patek Philippe because it matters to this story. It was made in Geneva, Switzerland, beginning production in 1948. And it is, by any honest measure, one of the finest mechanical watches ever built. It has no battery, no electronics of any kind. It runs entirely on precision engineering, gears, springs, levers, and the careful calibration of metal against metal. To use one properly, you have to slow down. You have to think before you wind. Reverend Whitfield understood that. I think that is why he loved it. For 3 weeks, at the end of that summer, every Saturday and Sunday afternoon, Lorraine sat at the repair bench while I walked her through the watch. How the mainspring stored energy when you wound the crown, how the gear train transmitted that energy in measured intervals, how the escapement released it. One precise tick at a time, governing the entire mechanism with a patience that was mechanical in origin, but felt, if you held the watch to your ear and listened long enough, almost moral. She was a careful student, methodical, unhurried, asking questions that went straight to the center of things the way her questions always did. She did not ask how to make the watch run faster. She asked why it was designed to run at exactly this speed and no other. She did not ask what the balance wheel did. She asked why the balance wheel oscillated at that particular frequency and what would happen to the rest of the mechanism if it changed. These were not the questions of a hobbyist. They were the questions of a woman who had spent her life teaching children that every note in a piece of music existed in relationship to every other note, and that changing one changed all of them. She reminded me more than once that summer why I had married her. The afternoons had a particular quality I have not encountered since. The June light came through the linen curtains Lorraine had hung on the south window in 1991, pale blue fabric with brass rings, casting soft bands across the bench that moved slowly as the hours passed. The ceiling fan turned above us at its lowest setting, the faint click of the pull chain marking time in its own way. Lorraine sat on the customer stool with her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, leaning forward over the open case, back with the concentration of a person who is not simply looking at something, but listening to it with her eyes. I showed her the escapement first, because that is where the philosophy of a watch lives. The escapement is the heart. It is the mechanism that converts the raw energy of the mainspring into the regulated, even pulse that drives the hands. Without it, the spring would simply unwind in a single violent release, all its stored energy spent in an instant. The escapement is what teaches the spring patience. Lorraine understood that immediately. She looked up from the bench and said something I have never forgotten. "A clock does not measure time, Tom. It gives time a shape you can hold." I set down the loop I was using and looked at her. In 39 years of working with timepieces, I had never heard anyone describe it that way. It was, I realized, sitting there in the afternoon light with the woman I had loved for 34 years. The most accurate thing anyone had ever said about my profession. She mentioned her father often during those afternoons, not with the careful avoidance that some people use when discussing the dead, but with the easy specificity of someone who has carried a person with them long enough to know exactly where they are kept. She told me about the way he wound the Patek Philippe every morning at the kitchen table before breakfast. The same number of turns, the same deliberate motion. She told me about the way he held it to his ear after winding and listened for a moment before placing it in his vest pocket, the way a musician listens to a tuning fork before beginning to play. And she told me something he used to say, a thing he had learned from 23 years of standing before a congregation and reading the room before he opened his mouth. He always said, Lorraine told me, her hands resting on either side of the open watch, that you could tell everything about a person by what they did with their hands in the first 30 seconds, whether they were there to listen or there to be seen. I nodded at the time and went back to the palette jewel I was cleaning. I thought it was a preacher's observation, something about the difference between genuine attention and performance. I did not think about it again for 6 years. I would think about it then, And I would understand exactly what Reverend Whitfield had meant. And I would understand it because of a woman who walked into my shop and did something with her hands in the first 30 seconds that told me everything I needed to know. But that was later. That summer, in the light through Lorraine's curtains, I was simply teaching my wife how a watch worked, and she was teaching me, without either of us knowing it, how to see what I had been looking at for 39 years. It was on the third Saturday that she found it. Lorraine had the Patek Philippe open on the bench, caseback removed the way I had shown her. She was examining the movement the way she examined everything, with the slow thoroughness of a person who believed that rushing past a detail was the same as lying about it. And then her hands stopped. Not the way hands stop when they are tired. Not the way they stop when they lose interest. The way they stop when they have found something they were not looking for and have not yet decided what it means. She looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 34 years of marriage. Something between surprise and recognition. The expression of a person who has just discovered that a thing they thought they knew completely had been holding a secret the entire time. "Tom," she said, "come look at this." I came around to her side of the bench. Lorraine had the case back off and the movement exposed, the way I had shown her the previous Saturday. And she was holding the watch at a slight angle under the repair lamp, so the light fell directly into the interior. Inside the Patek Philippe, fitted against the inner face of the caseback, was a thin panel of metal, custom cut, held in place by two small pins that had been set by hand, precisely, deliberately, by someone who understood metalwork well enough to modify a watch without disturbing its mechanism. It was a false floor. The space beneath it was no larger than a folded postage stamp, perhaps 2 centimeters deep, barely enough to hold a slip of paper. But it was there, intentional, hidden by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. I recognized the craftsmanship immediately. The pins were brass, the same gauge as the pins used in mid-century watch repair, and they had been set with a jeweler's precision that went beyond what most watchmakers would attempt inside a case this small. Reverend Whitfield had not been a watchmaker, but he had been a man who paid attention to how things were made, and he had clearly paid attention long enough to learn what he needed. Lorraine did not say anything for a long moment. She looked at the false floor, then at me, then back at the watch. Her hands were completely still. The ceiling fan turned above us. The light through the curtains had shifted while we worked, moving from the bench to the floor, and the shop had taken on the particular amber quality it took on in the late afternoon when the sun dropped behind the buildings on the west side of Broughton and the only light left was indirect and warm. Then she set the case back in place, turned the lock, and handed the watch to me. "Tom," she said, "if you needed to leave someone a message they could not ignore, where would you hide it?" I remember looking at the watch in my hands, then looking at her. She was watching me with the quiet one, the smile she kept for moments when she knew something the rest of the room did not. The smile I had first seen across a dinner table in 1982 and had never entirely learned to read. I told her I did not know what I would do. I said maybe I would put it somewhere obvious, right out in the open, where people would see it every day but never think to look at it closely. She seemed to like that answer. She picked up her coffee and did not say another word about the watch for the rest of the afternoon. We sat in the quiet of the shop and talked about other things. The maple pecan pie she wanted to make for Nathan's birthday in October, whether the ceiling fan needed rebalancing, the mockingbird that had taken up residence in the magnolia tree in the backyard and sang the same 5 phrases in the same order every morning at 4:30 without variation, which Lorraine said reminded her of a particular school board member she declined to name. I did not ask her what she was thinking. That is something I have gone back to more times than I can count in the years since. The question I did not ask. In a summer full of questions I should have. She kept coming to the shop every weekend until mid-October, when the treatments made the afternoons too difficult. By then she knew the Patek Philippe well enough to take it apart in the dark, I think. She never told me what she found in that hidden space, or whether Reverend Whitfield had left anything there, or whether she had put something there herself. I did not press her. That was the mistake. Lorraine died on a Thursday morning in February of 2017, in the room at the end of the hall in our house on Broughton Street. The Patek Philippe was on the nightstand beside her. She had asked me to bring it up from the shop a week earlier. I did not know why. I thought she just wanted it nearby. The way you want familiar things nearby when the unfamiliar is closing in. She left me the watch. She left me the shop. And she left me something else. Something I would not find for another 6 years, because I was not ready to look. The months after Lorraine died had the quality of a season that does not know when to end. I opened the shop at 8:30. I closed it at 5:30. I ate dinner at the kitchen table on Broughton Street with the radio tuned to the jazz station out of Savannah State because Lorraine had always kept it there, and changing the station seemed like a concession I was not prepared to make. I lit the candle each evening beside the Patek Philippe on its square of blue velvet. I slept, woke, and did it again. The grief passed through me in the first year the way a hard season passes, leaving the ground changed underneath. What I settled into by 2020 was something steadier. It was not a small life. It was a life that fit the shape of what I had left. And I had made my peace with that. The Patek Philippe sat on the velvet square in the display case. I held it every evening. I never opened the case back. I had told myself it was respect. I had told myself it was grief. Both of those things were true in the way that incomplete answers are true. They covered enough of the surface to keep me from looking at what was underneath. 5 years passed. The curtains Lorraine had hung in 1991 continued to throw their bands of light across the repair bench every morning. The candle burned every evening. The watch waited. Then one Friday afternoon in March of 2022, my son walked through the door, and he did not come alone. I should tell you something about my son before I tell you about the woman he brought with him. Because Nathan matters to everything that follows. Nathan Beaumont was 33 years old that spring. An architect who had moved to a firm in Savannah 3 years earlier after finishing his graduate work in Charleston, designing restoration plans for historic commercial buildings in the coastal southeast. He had Lorraine's eyes. That particular shade of warm brown that changed depending on the light. Darker in the morning, almost amber by late afternoon. And he had inherited his mother's way of listening, which is to say he listened with his whole face. The way a person listens when they believe that what you are saying deserves the full weight of their attention. He came to the shop maybe once every 6 weeks, usually on a Saturday. Usually with coffee from the place on Bull Street that he knew I liked. The dark roast with chicory that they made in the old style. He called every Sunday evening without fail, the way Lorraine had asked him to when he left for college, and Nathan had never stopped. Sometimes the calls were 5 minutes, sometimes 40. It did not matter. The regularity of them was the point, and we both understood that without having discussed it. That Friday he called ahead, which was unusual. He said he was coming by after work and wanted to stop in. He said he was bringing someone. His voice had a particular quality I had not heard in a long time. Lighter somehow, the way a voice sounds when a window has been opened somewhere and the person speaking does not yet realize they are letting you hear the air coming through. They arrived just after 4. Nathan came through the door first, unwinding his scarf, and behind him was a woman who filled the doorway in the way that certain people do, not because of size but because of how they carry the space around them. She was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in her early 30s with the kind of good looks that tend to come packaged with confidence, the sort of confidence that is not quite earned and not quite performed, but exists somewhere in the territory between the two. She extended her hand across the counter before Nathan had finished his introduction. "Vanessa Cole," she said. "I have heard so much about this place." Her grip was firm without being aggressive, the practiced handshake of someone who shakes a great many hands. I told her it was good to meet her, and meant neither more nor less than that. Nathan explained they had met at an architecture and development conference in Savannah earlier that month. A 2-day event focused on historic corridor preservation and commercial investment. Vanessa, he said, worked in commercial real estate. specifically in regional acquisition and development consulting for historic districts. She had a card, which she offered without being asked. I set it on the counter beside the register and did not look at it again while she was in the shop. Here is something 39 years of repair work teaches you. How to read the way a person enters a room. Not in any mystical sense. Just in the plain, practical sense of observation. The customers who come in nervous hold their watches too tightly. The ones who do not understand the value of what they have set it down too casually. The ones who are genuinely curious look at the clocks first, and the ones who are assessing look at the walls, the windows, the square footage, and then at the person behind the counter. Vanessa looked at the walls first, then the windows, then the ceiling briefly. The way someone does when they are estimating the height of a room. Then the front window, and the view it gave onto Broughton Street, then finally at me. I kept my expression easy. I have had 39 years of practice at that too. She was polite throughout. Genuinely pleasant, actually. The kind of pleasant that is very difficult to fault because it leaves no fingerprints. She asked reasonable questions about the shop. How long had I been on this block? Did I own or lease? Had the neighborhood changed much in the last decade? Each question arrived wrapped in what sounded like casual conversation, the kind of small talk that fills the first 10 minutes between strangers. But the order of the questions was wrong. A woman who is simply making conversation with her boyfriend's father asks about the work first. She asks about the watches in the case, or the tools on the bench, or how long it takes to repair a mainspring. She does not begin within the first 5 minutes by asking about the lease arrangement and whether Broughton Street had appreciated in value. That is not curiosity. That is an assessment conducted in the key of friendliness. I thought about Reverend Whitfield. I heard Lorraine's voice in the quiet of the shop the way I sometimes heard it. Not as a haunting but as a fact. The way you hear the ticking of a clock you have lived with long enough. You could tell everything about a person by what they did with their hands in the first 30 seconds. Vanessa's hands had gone to the counter first. Palms flat. Fingers spread slightly. Measuring the width of the surface without appearing to measure anything at all. The gesture of a person who sees dimensions before she sees the man standing behind them. At one point, Vanessa gestured toward the front window and said, 39 years in the same spot. That is remarkable. This whole block must be worth something now. I smiled at her. It is worth exactly what it has always been worth to me. She smiled back, and the moment passed, and we talked about other things. Nathan showed her the display case. She asked a few questions about the watches there. Surface questions. The kind that satisfied Nathan that she was interested. When they left 20 minutes later, Vanessa shook my hand again with the same practiced confidence and said it had been a real pleasure. Nathan hugged me at the door, brief and firm, and said he would call Sunday. I stood at the front window and watched them walk down Broughton toward the parking structure on Bull Street. His hand at the small of her back. Her stride easy and matched to his. They looked like a couple at the beginning of something, which is exactly what they were, though the something was not the same thing for both of them. I told myself I was being an overprotective father. I told myself that Vanessa was simply a confident young woman in a competitive profession, asking the kinds of questions that people in her line of work asked about everything out of habit. I told myself that Nathan was happy. And he was genuinely, visibly happy, in a way I had not seen in years, and that was what mattered. I almost believed it. I would have believed it, I think, if the questions had not started. Nathan and Vanessa married on a Saturday in October, at a small venue outside Savannah, with a view of the salt marshes to the east. It was a warm evening. Clear. The kind of Georgia autumn night that makes you forget the humidity of the summer you survived to get there. The Spartina grass was gold in the last light, and the marsh water reflected the sky in long, flat mirrors that moved with the tide. Nathan wore a gray suit that fit him well. Vanessa wore a dress the color of cream. She looked, I will admit, beautiful in the way that certain people look beautiful when they are standing at the center of something they have planned carefully. Every detail attended to. Every surface polished. Nathan looked like his mother, not in the dress or the features but in a gesture, a tilt of the head when the officiant spoke, a quality of stillness that caught me off guard, the way those resemblances sometimes do, arriving not where you expect them, but in the moments you are not braced for. I danced with him once, badly. The way fathers dance with their sons at weddings when neither party has practiced, and both are pretending the clumsiness is charming rather than genuine. He laughed at me the same way Lorraine used to, starting deep in his chest. I drove home that night thinking I had done something right. By January of 2023, I had stopped thinking that. I should be honest about something. After that Friday afternoon in March, I had spent weeks turning Vanessa Cole over in my mind, the way you turn a watch over in your hands, when something about it does not sit right, but you cannot locate the specific fault. The case is polished. The crown wins smoothly. The hands move at the correct rate. And yet, there is something in the sound of the mechanism, some quality in the tick that tells a trained ear the tolerances are not what they should be. I could not find the specific fault. Everything about Vanessa was correct on the surface. Polite. Attentive to Nathan. Respectful to me, in the measured way that a certain kind of person is respectful to the fathers of men they are pursuing. Nathan was happy. That part was real. And I knew the difference between performed happiness and the genuine article. By the time they announced their engagement that August, I had nearly convinced myself that a watchmaker's habit of listening for hidden faults had led me somewhere it did not belong. The questions began at dinner. Nathan and Vanessa had moved into a house on Tatnall Street the previous fall, a 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and a yard shaded by a live oak, so old its lowest branches touched the ground. They had us, meaning me, over for dinner every month or 6 weeks, and those evenings were pleasant enough. Vanessa cooked, which she did competently and with attention to presentation. She set the table precisely. She chose the wine with the same careful attention she gave everything. The table always looked like a photograph of a table rather than a table where people actually ate, which is a distinction I would not have been able to articulate at the time, but which I recognized in the same wordless way I recognized when a movement was running 2 seconds fast. Vanessa had started calling me Dad sometime after the wedding, and I had not objected, though I noticed when it began. It arrived the way certain things arrive in a relationship, without announcement, testing whether the space it occupies will hold its weight. Dad, she said one evening in January, between the main course and dessert, have you given much thought to what happens with the shop when you retire? I told her I had not planned on retiring. She smiled at that, an easy smile, and said she understood completely, that some men were built for the work, and she respected it. But she mentioned, as though it had only just occurred to her, that a property on Broughton Street in the current market must represent a considerable asset. She framed it as concern for my security, for Nathan's peace of mind. She said Nathan worried about me working alone, which was true enough that I could not dismiss it as invention. He worries, I agreed. I appreciate it. We just want to make sure you are taken care of, she said, and poured more wine. And the conversation moved to something else. I drove home that night turning the exchange over. The question itself was not unreasonable. A daughter-in-law asking about an aging father-in-law's retirement plans could be nothing more than exactly what it appeared. But the way she had moved from general concern to property value to Broughton Street specifically, in the span of about 90 seconds, without it seeming rushed, that took practice. The same question came back in different forms over the next 3 months. At a Sunday lunch in February, Vanessa mentioned that a commercial property 2 blocks from the shop had recently sold at a significant premium. At a dinner in early March, she asked whether I owned the building outright or leased. Just curious, she said, in case there were options worth knowing about for tax purposes. At an April gathering, she brought up the waterfront development project and how it was going to reshape property values along the entire Broughton corridor within 5 years. Each time the question arrived wrapped in something that sounded like care. Each time I answered simply and moved on. I kept a small notebook, brown cover, unlined pages, the kind I had used for repair notes for 30 years. I started writing the dates and the questions down. Not because I had decided anything, Because a man who has spent 39 years documenting the faults in delicate mechanisms does not stop documenting when the mechanism in question is a conversation. Then came the afternoon that changed things. Pearl Washington had worked in my shop for 15 years. She was a compact, efficient woman in her late 50s who had come to me originally to have her late mother's anniversary clock restored and had never quite left. She knew the inventory the way I knew it, by feel as much as by sight. And she had a particular system for the paper files in the back office. Lease documents, vendor contracts, insurance records, tax filings, all arranged in a specific order she had established in her first year and never deviated from since. On a Thursday afternoon in late April, Vanessa stopped by the shop. She said she was meeting Nathan for dinner, and he had asked her to wait there. Nathan arrived 20 minutes later, and they left together. Pearl stayed to close up, as she often did on Thursdays. The next morning she came to me before we opened. "Tom," she said, setting her coat on the hook by the door, "I do not want to make something out of nothing, but the files in the office are not the way I left them." She described it precisely. 2 folders pulled slightly forward, the lease documents and the property insurance summary. Not dramatically out of place. The kind of shift you would only notice if you had arranged them yourself and had reason to look carefully. I thanked her. I told her I would take care of it. I did not tell her what I was already thinking. That evening I drove to an electronics supplier I had used on Whitaker Street and purchased a small digital recording module, the kind used in commercial security systems, no larger than a deck of playing cards. I had been repairing clocks and watches for them with. I understood mechanisms. I understood how to fit a working component inside a housing that was designed for something else entirely. And I understood that a camera, at its most basic, was nothing more than a device for recording what was there, whether or not anyone was watching. I had an old grandfather clock sitting in the back corner of the shop, a Howard Miller from the early 1960s that had come in as a consignment piece 3 years ago and never sold. Its case was solid walnut, deep enough and with enough interior space once the pendulum assembly was repositioned to accommodate what I needed. The glass front panel provided a clear sight line to the repair counter and the office doorway. I spent the better part of that Sunday fitting the module inside, positioning the lens behind the glass at an angle that covered the counter, the display case along the left wall, and the open doorway to the back office. Running a thin wire to a small battery pack I secured behind the lower panel where I kept spare pendulum rods. The work was precise and unhurried in the way that all my work was precise and unhurried. The difference was that this time I was not restoring something. I was building something new inside, something old. A watching mechanism inside a timekeeping mechanism. There was a symmetry to that which I did not find amusing but did find appropriate. On Monday morning I positioned the grandfather clock in the shop at the end nearest the office door, angled slightly outward, indistinguishable from the half-dozen other clocks, standing and sitting in various states of repair around the room. I tested the camera angle 3 times before I was satisfied. Then I wound the clock. It began ticking with the deep, steady voice of a well-made movement that had been silent too long and was grateful for the attention. I did not know yet what Vanessa was truly after. But I knew one thing Lorraine had taught me. Or rather, one thing she had reminded me that her father understood before either of us. A clock does not lie. The hands go where the mechanism takes them, and I intended to let this one do the telling. A week later, I drove to Broughton Street. I needed someone who understood the law the way I understood time, down to the smallest, most hidden part. Carlton Hayes had his office in a building near the corner of Drayton and State. A 2-story brick structure that had been a cotton warehouse in a previous century and still carried that quality of solidity, as though the walls had been built to hold something heavier than legal files and depositions. His name was on a brass plate beside the door. Just his name and the word attorney beneath it. No flourishes, no list of specialties. Carlton had never needed to advertise what he was good at. I had known him since 1999, when a dispute over the terms of my building lease on Broughton Street had required someone who could read a commercial contract the way I read a clock mechanism, looking for the place where the tolerances were off. Carlton had found it in an afternoon. We had stayed in touch in the way that men of a certain generation stay in touch, not frequently, but reliably. A phone call every few months. Lunch when the occasion warranted it. His daughter, Elise, had studied violin with Lorraine for 6 years, from 5th grade through her junior year of high school. Lorraine had said once that Elise played the way some people pray, with the earnestness of someone who believed completely in what they were doing and did not care whether anyone else believed. Elise was a music teacher now herself in Atlanta. I had never forgotten that. Carlton had come to Lorraine's service in February of 2017 and stood in the back row without being asked, which I have never forgotten either. He was 66 now, built like a man who had once been athletic and had settled into a kind of measured solidity that had nothing to do with softness and everything to do with patience. He kept his office the way I kept my bench. Spare. Functional. Everything in its place. For a reason. When I called that morning and asked if he had time, he told me to come at 8. He was already at his desk when I arrived. Coffee made. Legal pad open. I told him everything. The questions at dinner beginning in January. The rotation of concerns, retirement, property value, the lease arrangement, the asset implications. The way each question arrived, dressed in something that sounded like care. Pearl and the files. The camera I had installed in the grandfather clock. I laid it out in sequence. The way I would describe a clock's failure to a customer. Not with emotion, just with the facts in the order they occurred. Because that is the only way to find where something went wrong. Carlton wrote while I talked. He did not look up often. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me across the desk. Tom, he said, you are not paranoid. You are precise. There is a difference. He explained what he could do, and more importantly, what he could do legally. In his 16 years as a federal prosecutor with the United States Attorney's Office in Savannah, where he had handled real estate fraud and financial crimes cases across the Georgia coast, he had developed both the knowledge and the contacts to move through certain kinds of information without leaving footprints. Business registration records were public documents. Court filings were public record. Property transaction histories were filed with the county clerk and open to inspection. He also mentioned Maria Santos. Maria had been a special agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives for 17 years before retiring in 2020. She now worked as a licensed private investigative consultant out of an office on Montgomery Street. She was thorough, Carlton said. And she understood financial structures the way some people understood plumbing, by following the pipes until she found where the pressure was building. I want to be clear about something, Carlton said, leaning back in his chair. Right now, what you have is a pattern of behavior that concerns you. That is not nothing, but it is not evidence of anything illegal yet. What we are doing at this stage is building a picture. If there is something to find, we will find it. If there is not, you will know that too. I told him I understood. I told him to start. Carlton called me in the 3rd week of September. I was at the bench working through a stubborn balance staff on a Longines from the 1950s when the phone rang. Carlton's voice had a particular quality when he had found something significant, a kind of deliberate evenness, like a man making sure he does not say more than he means to. He asked me to come to the office. I closed the shop early for the first time in 12 years. Maria Santos was already there when I arrived. She was sitting in the chair beside Carlton's desk, with a laptop open and a legal pad filled with handwriting that was small and precise and tilted slightly to the left. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, dark hair pulled back, no jewelry except a plain watch on her left wrist that I recognized as a Seiko diver's model from the 1980s. The kind of watch a person wears when they need something that works and do not care whether it impresses anyone. She did not stand when I came in. She nodded once and turned the laptop so I could see the screen. That was Maria. Carlton had told me she was thorough. What he had not told me was that she was also entirely without ceremony. Carlton had a folder on the desk, thin but specific. He opened it and walked me through what he and Maria had found. The public record trail began with the Chatham County Clerk's office. where property transactions along Broughton Street were filed and accessible to anyone with the patience to read through them. Maria had read through all of them. Every commercial property transfer on the eastern corridor of Broughton Street going back 6 years, cross-referenced against business registration filings in the Georgia Secretary of State's database, and supplemented by Richard-level observation of publicly accessible commercial directories and professional networks. What she had found was a pattern. 9 of the 14 commercial properties on the eastern corridor of Broughton Street had changed ownership in the past 6 years. A dry cleaner that had operated for 22 years, gone. A framing shop near the corner of Abercorn, sold. A vacant storefront that had been a jeweler until 2021. Mixed-use buildings near the Bull Street intersection. 2 others closer to the north end that had been family-owned businesses for decades. Different buyers on paper, different LLC names on every filing, but the same registered agent on each one. A paralegal named Don Kelly, whose name appeared in the incorporation documents for 4 separate entities over the past decade. All of them connected through layers of corporate filing that were designed to look unrelated to a single source. Carlton placed his finger on the map he had unfolded across his desk. A street map of Broughton, the eastern corridor marked in red, where properties had changed hands. The company behind all of this, he said, is called Cole Southern Development. The principal is a man named Gerald Cole, 74 years old, based in Savannah. He has been assembling this block since at least 2018. He moved his finger along the map, touching each red-marked property in sequence, then stopping at the corner parcel where Broughton met Bull Street. My building. My shop. The address I had occupied for 39 years. Without the corner building, Carlton said, the footprint does not work. The development plan requires continuous frontage along both streets for the anchor retail component. Your building is the last piece. It has been the last piece since at least 2020, when Cole acquired the adjacent property. I looked at the map. I looked at Carlton's finger on the corner. I said nothing for a moment because the moment required silence the way certain moments do. The way the space between 2 ticks of a clock is not emptiness, but the mechanism gathering itself. Vanessa, I said. Maria turned to the second page of her notes. She spoke for the first time since I had arrived, and her voice had the flat precision of a person who had spent 17 years writing federal reports and had never learned to soften facts for the benefit of the listener. Vanessa Cole, she said. Granddaughter of Gerald Cole. Not niece, not distant relation. Granddaughter. She is listed as a consultant on 3 Cole Southern Development Project filings going back to 2019. She turned the laptop toward me again. On the screen was a conference program from the Savannah Architecture and Historic Preservation Forum, March 2022. The event where Nathan had met Vanessa. Her name was listed as a panelist on a session titled Commercial Corridor Investment in Historic Southern Markets. Nathan's name was on the attendee list, which had been published on the conference website 2 weeks before the event. His employer, his title, and his surname were all visible. I found his LinkedIn profile in approximately 3 minutes, Maria said. His father's name is listed under family on his personal page. The shop's address appears in a Savannah magazine feature from 2019 that is indexed by every major search engine. She closed the laptop. The conference was not an accident, Carlton said. He was not unkind about it. He stated it simply, as a fact that required stating. The meeting was arranged. Vanessa knew who Nathan was before she introduced herself. I sat with that for a long time. The October light came through Carlton's office window at a low angle and lay across the map in a pale bar, illuminating the grid of Broughton Street and the 9 marked parcels and the corner building that had been my address for 39 years. I thought about Nathan. The particular quality of his voice on the phone that Friday in March of 2022. Lighter, he had sounded. Like a window had been opened. I had heard it and been glad for him. I had not considered that someone might have opened that window on purpose. She was selected, Maria said. She was looking at me steadily with the expression of a person who has delivered difficult information many times and has learned that the delivery matters less than the silence that follows. Not him. He was selected. She did the selecting. I drove back to Broughton Street in the early evening. The Spanish moss was catching the last light the way it does in late September in Savannah, silver and still, hanging from the live oaks that lined the sidewalk like something the trees had been carrying for so long they had forgotten it was there. I thought about what Lorraine used to say about her father, about how Reverend Whitfield could hear a false note from the back of the church before the choir knew they had sung it. I was hearing one now, and it was getting louder. She came alone on the second Tuesday of November, 20 minutes before closing. I heard the bell above the door but did not look up immediately because I was adjusting the hairspring on a 1957 Omega Seamaster. And when you are bending a hairspring, you do not stop until the coil settles. The Omega needed another quarter turn. I gave it the quarter turn. Then I set down my tweezers and raised my head. Vanessa stood in the center of the shop, wearing a camel-colored coat I had not seen before, and holding a paper coffee cup from the cafe on the corner of Bull and Broughton. She smiled the way she always smiled, wide, immediate, practiced, and placed the cup on the counter, 3 inches from the velvet tray where the Patek Philippe rested. I moved the cup 6 inches to the left without comment. She did not appear to notice, or she chose not to. "I brought you a cortado," she said. "Nathan mentioned you've been skipping lunch." I thanked her and left the cup where I had placed it. She unbuttoned her coat, folded it over one arm, and looked around the shop the way she always looked. Around the shop ceiling first, then walls, then floor, then me. I had seen that sequence 4 times now. It never changed. A person who looks at a room before they look at you is measuring, not visiting. She asked about my blood pressure. She asked about the winter inventory. She asked whether I had considered hiring a second employee to help Pearl with the filing. Each question arrived with the right pause and the right softness, the way a metronome keeps perfect time without understanding the music it serves. I answered each one with the patience I had learned from 40 years of listening to broken movements. You do not rush a diagnosis. You let the mechanism reveal itself. Then she set her coat on the stool beside the counter, sat down and said, "Tom, I've been thinking about something, and I want to be honest with you." The word honest arrived a half-beat early, like a second hand jumping ahead of its index. I folded my hands on the workbench and waited. She told me that Nathan had been offered a consulting position with a firm in Charleston, a 6-month contract with the possibility of extension, good money, good hours, meaningful restoration work on antebellum civic buildings. She said Nathan was excited but worried about leaving me alone with the shop. She said she had been researching options, a short-term lease transfer, a management agreement, perhaps even a buyer who would preserve the space exactly as it was. She presented these options the way a dealer presents 3 cards on a table, and all 3 lead to the same pocket. "If your heart stopped beating tomorrow," she said, and then paused, as though the sentence had surprised her, "Nathan would inherit this building and have no idea what to do with it. I just want to make sure there's a plan." I looked at her hands. They were still, perfectly still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of rehearsal. Reverend Whitfield once told Lorraine that a person who holds completely still while lying is more dangerous than a person who fidgets, because the liar who fidgets has not yet committed to the lie. I told her I appreciated the thought. I told her I would consider her suggestions. I told her the cortado was getting cold, and she should drink it before she left. She smiled again, buttoned her coat, and walked out into the Savannah dusk. The bell rang twice, once when the door opened, once when it closed. I waited until her footsteps faded past the cobblestones. Then I turned to the grandfather clock and pressed the small button I had installed behind the pendulum casing. The footage confirmed what I already suspected. But confirmation is not the same as proof, and proof requires patience. Over the following weeks, I reviewed every recording the camera had captured since its installation. On a Thursday evening in late July 2023, the footage showed Vanessa entering the shop alone at 9:14 in the evening, using the side entrance key Nathan had given her. She went directly to the office, opened the second filing drawer, removed the lease folder, and photographed each page with her phone. The recording lasted 11 minutes. She replaced the folder, closed the drawer, and left through the same door. On a Monday in mid-January 2024, the camera recorded a second visit. This time she opened the insurance binder, turned to the section listing the property's assessed value, and held her phone over the page for 9 seconds before returning it. 2 visits. 2 sets of documents, both concerning the building's legal and financial standing. Neither visit was mentioned to me, or, as far as I could determine, to Nathan. The following Friday, I asked Pearl to stay after closing. I made her a cup of the Earl Grey she kept in the kitchen cabinet and set it on the repair bench between us. Pearl looked at the tea, then at me, and her eyes filled before I said a word. She told me Vanessa had approached her in August, casually, at the farmer's market on Forsyth Park. Vanessa had asked about Tom's health, about the filing system, about whether the lease had an automatic renewal clause. Pearl answered because the question seemed like family concern. By October, Vanessa was texting Pearl directly small questions, always phrased as care, always ending with, "Don't bother Tom with this. He worries enough." Pearl realized what was happening only after the January visit, when Vanessa asked for the insurance contact's direct number, and Pearl heard something in the request that felt less like curiosity and more like preparation. "I should have told you sooner," Pearl said. I placed my hand over hers on the counter. Her fingers were trembling the way a second's hand trembles when the battery is almost gone, not from weakness, but from the effort of still trying to keep time. "You are telling me now," I said. "That is what matters." She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and picked up the tea with both hands. We sat in the quiet of the shop while the grandfather clock ticked its steady, truthful rhythm. And I thought about the Patek Philippe resting 6 inches away on its velvet square, and the letter inside it that I had not yet read, and the woman who had written it 9 years ago because she had already seen what was coming before anyone else had thought to look. I opened the Patek Philippe on a Saturday morning in early February 2024. 6 years and 11 months after Lorraine died. And I did it alone because some things cannot have a witness. The shop was closed. The sign on the door read, "Back at noon," in the handwriting. Pearl had taped there 3 years ago, and the street outside was the kind of quiet Broughton Street only manages before 8 o'clock. No tourists, no delivery trucks, just the sound of a mockingbird cycling through its 5 phrases on the awning of the hat shop next door. I set the Patek on the repair bench under the magnification lamp and turned the light to its lowest setting because gold looks truest in soft light. The case was warm from sitting near the window, and when I turned it over I could see the faintest fingerprints on the back mine, layered over years of handling, and beneath them, older prints that might have been Lorraine's or might have been her father's. I did not try to distinguish them. Some marks belong to everyone who has ever held a thing, and separating them would be a kind of violence. I removed the case back with the same tool I had used the afternoon. Lorraine and I discovered the compartment together, a flat-blade screwdriver, number 3, Swiss-made, with a rosewood handle worn smooth at the thumb. The 4 screws turned without resistance. I lifted the back, set it on the velvet tray, and looked at the movement, the bridges, the jewels, the balance wheel frozen at its apex because the mainspring had not been wound since the last Saturday. Lorraine visited the shop in October 2016. I studied it the way you study a face you have not seen in a long time, noting what has changed and what has not, and finding comfort in the parts that remain. Then I slid the flat blade beneath the thin brass panel that formed the false floor and lifted it. The 2 handy-set pins released with a click, so small you would miss it if the room were not perfectly silent. Beneath the panel, folded twice and pressed flat by 7 years of stillness, was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. I recognized it immediately. Lorraine kept that stationery in the drawer of the hallway desk at our house on Gaston Street, and she used it only for letters she considered permanent condolence notes, letters to Elise Hayes on her college graduation, a thank you to the oncologist who had been honest with her when honesty was the harder choice. I unfolded the letter with the same care I would use to open a 19th century pocket watch. The paper was dry but not brittle. The ink was bluey black. The handwriting steady and small. Every letter formed with the discipline of a woman who had spent 24 years teaching children to read music notation. The date at the top was the 12th of November 2016, 4 months before she died, 3 weeks after her last visit to the shop, and precisely 2 days after her final oncology appointment at Memorial Health, where Dr. Amira Patel had told her the tumor had crossed into the lymphatic system and the remaining window was weeks, not months. The letter read, "Tom, if you are reading this, then I am no longer beside you, and someone has given you a reason to open this watch. I am sorry for both. There is a man named Gerald Cole who has been buying property on Broughton Street through companies that do not carry his name. I learned this from Doreen Kelly, who taught piano at the community center before she became a paralegal. She told me in confidence in September, and I confirmed what I could through the county clerk's records at the Chatham County Courthouse. His daughter, whose married name I do not know, works in commercial real estate and has attended 2 city planning meetings where our block was discussed. I do not know his full intention, but I know that our shop sits on the last parcel he needs, and I know that he is patient. I did not tell you because you were caring for me. And a man who is caring for his dying wife should not also have to fight for his home. But I am telling you now because I trust your hands more than I trust anyone else's judgment. You will know what to do. You always did. You just sometimes needed a little more time to believe it. Do not sell the shop. Do not let anyone sell it for you. And if our son brings someone home whose questions feel like measurements, listen to what she asks before you listen to what she says. The watch keeps time. Let it keep this too. All my love. Always. Lorraine. I read the letter 3 times. The first time I read it as a husband. The second time I read it as a watchmaker, noting the precision of every sentence, the way she structured information, the way a movement structures energy stored, released, regulated, purposeful. The third time I read it as the man she had described, the one who always knew what to do but needed more time to believe it, and I felt something shift behind my sternum that was not grief and was not anger, but was closer to the sound a mainspring makes when it finally engages the barrel after years of being unwound, a tension becoming motion, a stillness becoming force. She had known. Not everything. Not the exact shape of it. But enough. She had seen Gerald Cole's pattern, the way a musician sees a rest in a score not as silence but as a deliberate space where something is being withheld. She had traced the public records herself. A woman undergoing chemotherapy in the autumn of her life. Sitting in the county clerk's office with her reading glasses and her blue-black pen, building a map of ownership the same way Maria Santos would build one 7 years later. And when she had enough, she folded the map into a letter, folded the letter into a watch, and trusted that I would find it when the time required it. I set the letter on the velvet tray beside the open case back and called Carlton Hayes. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting. I found it, I said. There was a pause. Then Carlton said, "Read it to me." I read it. When I finished, there was a longer pause, the kind of silence that forms when a lawyer is recalculating every assumption he has held for the past 5 months. I heard him exhale. "She named him," Carlton said. "She named Gerald Cole. She cited county records, and she identified the pattern. Tom, this letter does not just confirm what we found, it predates it by 7 years. A jury will understand what that means." I looked at the Patek Philippe lying open on the bench, its movement exposed, its secret compartment empty for the first time since 1916, when Reverend Whitfield's watchmaker had installed the false floor. For reasons none of us would ever know, the watch looked lighter without the letter, as though it had been carrying a weight it was never designed to hold. I thanked Carlton, hung up, and sat in the quiet shop while the grandfather clock ticked behind me, and the mockingbird outside completed its 6th cycle. Then I refolded the letter along its original creases, placed it inside a clear archival sleeve I kept in the supply drawer, and locked it in the shop safe beside the lease, the insurance binder, and the brown notebook where I had recorded every question Vanessa had ever asked me. The Patek Philippe I left open on the bench. It had carried the secret long enough. Now, it was my turn. Carlton Hayes called me on a Wednesday evening in late February 2024, 3 weeks after I had read him Lorraine's letter over the phone. He asked me to come to his office the following morning, early, before the foot traffic on Broughton Street made parking difficult. He said he had something to show me and that Maria Santos would be there. He did not say what it was. Carlton never previewed his findings. He believed that evidence should be presented whole, the way a watchmaker presents a finished movement assembled, tested, and running rather than handed over in pieces that invite premature conclusions. I arrived at 8:15. The office occupied the second floor of a converted cotton warehouse at Drayton and State, and the staircase still carried the faint smell of raw fiber and river salt that no amount of renovation could fully remove. Carlton's door was open. Maria was already seated at the long oak table beneath the window, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a laptop open in front of her, and 3 manila folders arranged in a row, like evidence exhibits at a deposition. Carlton stood at the far end of the table, holding a ceramic mug that read, Savannah Bar Association 5K 2011, a race I knew for a fact he had never run. He gestured me to sit, poured me coffee from the pot on the credenza, and began. I need to take you back 11 years, he said, to a case I worked in 2013, the last year before I left the federal prosecutor's office. I had known Carlton since 1999, when he represented me in a lease dispute with a landlord who wanted to triple my rent after a rezoning vote. In 25 years of friendship, he had never once mentioned a 2013 case. That silence, I would learn, had not been casual. It had been professional, bound by the restrictions of a sealed federal investigation that had only recently been partially declassified through a Freedom of Information request Maria had filed in January. Carlton opened the first folder and placed 3 photographs on the table. Each photograph showed a different commercial block in a different Georgia city, Augusta, Macon, and Brunswick, and each block had been acquired parcel by parcel over a period of 4 to 6 years through a network of LLCs. In each case, the registered agent was a local paralegal with no prior connection to development. In each case, the acquiring entity traced back, through 2 or 3 corporate layers, to a single holding company registered in Delaware. And in each case, the final parcel, the corner lot, the anchor, the piece without which the assembled block had no continuous frontage, was obtained not through market purchase, but through pressure applied to the owner's family. The holding company was Tideline Partners, LLC. Its sole managing member, listed in a 2012 Delaware filing that Maria had retrieved from the Division of Corporations, was Gerald Allen Cole. I looked at the photographs for a long time. The blocks in Augusta and Macon had been redeveloped into mixed-use commercial centers. The block in Brunswick had stalled after the owner of the final parcel, a 71-year-old woman who operated a fabric store, refused to sell and filed a complaint with the Georgia Attorney General's office. That complaint triggered the 2013 federal investigation. Carlton had been assigned to assess whether the pattern of acquisition constituted wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343 or a conspiracy to defraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. The investigation was closed in early 2014 without indictment. The evidence was strong on pattern but thin on specific intent, and the fabric store owner withdrew her complaint after her daughter, who lived in Atlanta, received a letter from an attorney she had never heard of, suggesting that her mother's lease contained a technical violation that could result in eviction. The woman sold the parcel 4 months later at 60% of its appraised value. Carlton told me he had argued for continuing the case. He was overruled. He left the prosecutor's office that December. I have carried that case for 11 years, Carlton said. When you read me Lorraine's letter, and I heard the name Gerald Cole, I did not sleep that night. Not because I was surprised, because I was ashamed it had taken this long for the pattern to surface again. Maria opened the second folder. Inside was a printout from a health insurance portal, showing that someone had accessed Tom Beaumont's medical records, specifically his cardiology file, which documented a mild aortic valve irregularity diagnosed in 2019 through a query routed from a provider network login assigned to a clinic in Pooler, Georgia. The access occurred on the 3rd of September 2023, 5 days before Vanessa's first direct question about Tom's retirement plans. Maria explained that unauthorized access to medical records constituted a violation of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and that the Pooler Clinic's office manager had confirmed the login credentials belonged to a staff account that had been shared, against policy, with an outside consultant whose name the manager declined to provide without a subpoena. "They accessed your heart," Maria said, and the sentence carried a weight that had nothing to do with cardiology. Carlton opened the third folder. It contained a draft memorandum addressed to the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, outlining the pattern of LLC acquisitions across 4 Georgia cities: Augusta, Macon, Brunswick, and now Savannah. The use of intermediary paralegals, the HIPAA breach, and the connection between Vanessa Cole and Gerald Cole, as established through corporate filings, conference records, and Lorraine's letter. The memorandum cited potential violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, 18 U.S.C. Section 1000-343, and 26 U.S.C. Section 7206. It requested that the IRS open a preliminary inquiry. Carlton set the memorandum on the table and placed his pen beside it. "This is where we are," he said. "We have Lorraine's letter, which establishes knowledge and intent 7 years before the current scheme matured. We have Maria's property research, which maps the Savannah acquisitions. We have the 2013 investigation, which proves this is not Gerald Cole's first attempt. And we have a HIPAA breach that connects the timeline directly to Vanessa. What we do not yet have is Nathan." I understood what he meant. Every gear in the mechanism had been identified, measured, and cataloged except the one closest to me: my son. I did not know whether Nathan was a conspirator, a fool, or something more painful than either. A man who had chosen not to see what was in front of him, because seeing it would cost him the life he had built. "I will talk to him," I said. Carlton shook his head. "Not yet. Let the clock run a little longer. When the hour strikes, he will hear it, whether he wants to or not." I drove home along the river. The oaks on Victory Drive draped in Spanish moss so thick the branches bent under its weight. The moss hung in long gray curtains that moved in the breeze like the pendulums of clocks no one had built, keeping time to a rhythm only the trees understood. I thought about Gerald Cole sitting in his office somewhere in this city, assembling his block the way a man assembles a watch, one piece at a time. Each piece disguised as something ordinary, each piece essential. And I thought about Lorraine in the county clerk's office in the autumn of 2016, reading the same records Maria had read 7 years later, seeing the same pattern, and understanding that the only defense she could leave behind was a single sheet of crema-colored paper hidden inside a watch that had not been wound since her father died. The moss swayed. The river moved. And somewhere in the mechanism, a gear I could not yet see was already turning. Thanksgiving fell on the 28th of November that year, and for the first time since Lorraine died, I did not cook. Nathan and Vanessa invited me to their house on Tatnall Street, the 2-story Victorian with the wraparound porch and the crepe myrtle in the side yard that Lorraine had admired every spring. I brought a bottle of Chateauneuf d'Uve Pape and a pecan pie from the bakery on Liberty Street. I arrived at 4 o'clock. The porch light was on. The door was open. Nathan met me in the hallway wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and an apron that still had the price tag hanging from the neck loop. He hugged me the way he always did. Long, firm, one hand on the back of my head. And for a moment, I let myself believe the world behind that embrace was the same world I had lived in before the camera, before the folders, before Maria Santos placed Gerald Cole's Delaware filing on a table and changed the shape of everything I understood about my son's marriage. The dining room was set for 4. I noticed the extra place and asked who else was coming. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen carrying roasted Brussels sprouts and said, "A friend of Nathan's, from the Charleston Project. His name is Davis. He is driving down this afternoon." She said it lightly, but the name registered. I had not heard Nathan mention a Davis before. I filed it beside the other names, in the brown notebook I kept in the shop safe. Davis arrived at 4:30. He was tall, broad-shouldered, early 40s, with a handshake that gripped a beat too long and an accent that sat between coastal South Carolina and boarding school polish. He complimented the house, the neighborhood, the crown molding, and the width of the original pine floorboards all within 6 minutes, each observation carrying the specificity of a man who appraises properties rather than one who admires them. His eyes moved in the same ceiling-walls-floor-person sequence I had observed in Vanessa 2 years earlier. Dinner was generous. The turkey was brined in a buttermilk when herbs soak, Vanessa said she found online. Though the technique was identical to one from a Southern Living issue Lorraine kept in our kitchen drawer. I did not mention this. Nathan carved with the knife set I had given him when he moved into his first apartment after graduate school. His hands were careful and slightly uncertain, the way they had been when I first taught him to use a coping saw at 14. He had inherited Lorraine's patience and my caution, a combination that made him a gifted architect and, I feared, a vulnerable husband. After the plates were cleared and Davis had stepped onto the porch to make a call, I helped Nathan carry dishes to the kitchen. Vanessa remained in the dining room. I stood at the sink, rinsing a platter, and asked my son a question I had been shaping for 3 months. "Nathan," I said, "are you happy?" He set a stack of plates on the counter and looked at me, not past me. Not at the wall, but at me directly, fully. The way he had looked at me the morning of Lorraine's funeral, when he stood beside the casket and said, "She told me to take care of you, Dad." His eyes held the same expression now. Love complicated by something he was not ready to name. "Not tonight, Dad," he said. He did not say no. He did not say yes. He said not tonight, which meant the question had reached him, and he was not willing to let it arrive. I recognized the response because I had given the same answer to Lorraine in the autumn of 2015, when she asked whether I was afraid of the results we were waiting for. Not tonight had meant I know the answer, but I need another day before I hold it. I dried my hands and placed my palm on his shoulder. He leaned into it, then straightened and resumed stacking plates. We did not speak about happiness again that night. At 9 o'clock, I said my goodbyes. Vanessa handed me leftover pie at the door. Smiling the wide, practiced smile I had catalogued so many times, it no longer registered as warmth. Davis shook my hand on the porch and said he hoped to visit the watch shop. I told him the door was always open, and meant it in exactly the way he would not have expected. Nathan walked me to my truck. The street was dark except for porch lights, and the air carried the November scent of wood smoke and magnolia leaves. He opened my door, waited for me to climb in, and stood with his hand on the frame the way he had stood at 18 when I dropped him off at Georgia Tech. Not ready to let go. Not able to say why. "Dad," he said, and then stopped. I waited. A watchmaker understands that the most important sound in a mechanism is the one that has not yet occurred. You do not fill the silence. You let the gear find its own tooth. "Drive safe," he said. I pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, I watched him stand in the street until my taillights reached the corner. His white shirt bright against the dark house, his hands in his pockets, his head bowed. He looked like a man at the edge of something he could feel but could not see. And I wanted to stop the truck and tell him everything. The camera, the folders, the letter, Gerald Cole, the investigation, all of it because he was my son, and he deserved to know the ground beneath him was not solid. But Carlton's voice held in my memory. "Let the clock run. When the hour strikes, he will hear it, whether he wants to or not." She arrived on a Monday in early March 2025, without calling first, which was itself a message. In 3 years of knowing Vanessa Cole, I had learned that she never did anything without preparation, and the absence of a phone call meant the visit had been prepared so thoroughly that a warning would only dilute its effect. The bell above the door rang once. She stepped inside carrying a leather portfolio the color of dark honey and a paper bag from the cafe on Bull Street. She set the bag on the counter, 2 cortados, one for each of us, and smiled. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. I was restringing the suspension spring on a 1928 Ansonia mantel clock, a job that requires steady hands and a tolerance for repetition. I set the spring down, removed my loop, and gestured to the stool across the bench. She sat, crossed her ankles, and placed the portfolio between us, the way a dealer places a final card on the table. "Tom, I want to talk about the future of this building." She opened the portfolio and removed 3 documents, each bound with a clear plastic cover and printed on heavy stock. The first was a market analysis of commercial property values along the eastern corridor of Broughton Street, prepared by a firm called Tidemark Appraisals, whose name I had never heard spoken aloud, but whose registered address, according to Maria Santos, matched a suite leased by Cole Southern Development. The analysis showed a 14% annual appreciation over the previous 5 years and projected a 22% increase over the next 3, driven by tourism infrastructure and a proposed streetcar extension. The second document was a purchase offer, $2,800,000 for the building and the land beneath it, payable in a single closing within 60 days, with a provision allowing me to remain in the shop as a tenant for up to 12 months at no rent. The buyer was listed as Harborline Holdings LLC, a name I recognized from Maria's research as one of 4 entities sharing the same registered agent Don Kelly's successor, a paralegal in Pooler named Rhonda Vickers. The third document was an alternative, a 12-year lease-you-back arrangement valued at $3,500,000, under which I would transfer ownership of the building to Harborline Holdings but retain operating rights to the ground floor for the duration of the lease. At the end of 12 years, the building would revert fully to Harborline, and I would receive a final payment of $200,000 as a termination bonus. Vanessa presented these options with the calm efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the numbers until they sounded like kindness. She pointed to the appreciation chart, circled a figure with her pen, and said, "This building is worth more now than it has ever been. In 5 years it will be worth more still, but you will be 76, and Nathan will be managing a career in Charleston. The question is not whether to act. The question is when." I looked at the documents. The type was clean, the margins precise, the language measured. Every clause had been written to sound protective of my health, of my comfort, of my legacy, while transferring the only asset Lorraine had ever asked me to defend. I thought about the letter in the shop safe, the line she had written in bluey-black ink on cream-colored stationery. "Do not sell the shop. Do not let anyone sell it for you." "What does Nathan think?" I asked. Vanessa paused. It was a short pause, no longer than a quarter a second, but I had spent 50 years listening to the hesitations inside mechanical movements, and a quarter a second was enough. "Nathan supports whatever decision you make," she said. "He just wants you to be comfortable." The sentence was constructed the way a counterfeit watch is constructed, every visible component in its correct position. But the weight wrong, the balance off, the resonance hollow. Nathan had not called me about this offer. Nathan had not mentioned it on our last Sunday phone call. If my son supported this decision, he did so in the way a man supports a wall he has been told is load-bearing, without ever checking the foundation himself. I closed the portfolio and slid it back across the bench. "I appreciate the effort," I said. "I need time." "Of course," she said. "Take whatever time you need. But the market window closes in July, and Harborline has other options on the corridor. If we wait past summer, the terms may change." The word we landed on the counter between us, like a coin dropped from a height, small, metallic, ringing. We. As though she and I were on the same side of the transaction. As though her interests and mine shared a common axis. As though the woman sitting across from me had not spent 3 years measuring my shop, photographing my lease, accessing my medical records, and building a case for acquisition that stretched from a paralegal in Pooler to a holding company in Delaware to a 74-year-old man whose name appeared in a sealed federal investigation from 2013. She finished her cortado, buttoned her coat, and left. The bell rang twice. I sat in the silence and looked at the Ansonia clock on the bench, its suspension spring still unattached, its pendulum motionless, its dial showing a time that belonged to no moment in particular. Then I picked up the phone and called Carlton Hayes. She made the offer, I said. Both options? Purchase and leaseback. 2.8 or 3.5. Deadline July. Carlton was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted them the way I count the oscillations of a balance wheel, not because the number matters, but because the rhythm tells you whether the mechanism is thinking or stalling. Good, he said. Now we set the table. I hung up, returned to the Ansonia, and reattached the suspension spring with hands that were steady, for the same reason they had always been steady, because the work required it, and because my wife had once told me that the truest measure of a man is not what he does when he is angry, but what he does when he is patient. The spring caught. The pendulum swung. And the clock, silent for 6 weeks, resumed its beat. Carlton chose the old pink house on Abercorn Street because it was the kind of restaurant where conversations carried weight and witnesses remembered faces. He reserved a private dining room on the 2nd floor for the evening of the 12th of April 2025, a Saturday, and he told me to wear the gray suit Lorraine had picked for our 40th anniversary. I did not ask why. Carlton understood that presentation was evidence. And a man in a suit his late wife had chosen was a man no jury would forget. I arrived at 6:30. The room had a single round table set for 7, a fireplace that had not held a fire in decades, and 3 tall windows overlooking the square where Spanish moss hung from the oaks like curtains on a stage that had been set long before any of us were born. Carlton was already seated, wearing a navy blazer and the reading glasses he only wore when he intended to read something aloud. Maria Santos sat to his left in a black jacket, her laptop closed on the table, a single flash drive beside it. To her left sat a man I had not met. Edwin Marsh, a forensic accountant Carlton had retained from a firm in Atlanta. Thin, quiet, with the posture of someone who spent his life following numbers into rooms where they were not expected. Nathan arrived at 6:45. He wore the brown sport coat I had given him 2 Christmases ago, and a look on his face that told me he did not understand why his father had invited him to dinner with 3 strangers and asked him to come alone. He hugged me, shook Carlton's hand, nodded at Maria and Edwin, and took the chair directly across from mine. He did not ask where Vanessa was. That silence told me more than any question would have. Vanessa arrived at 6:52, 8 minutes after Nathan, wearing the camel coat and carrying her phone in her right hand, the way she always carried it screen down, thumb on the edge, ready. She scanned the room in her usual sequence. Ceiling, walls, floor, faces. When her eyes reached Carlton, she paused for less than a second. But I saw it. A watchmaker sees every hesitation. She smiled, kissed Nathan on the cheek, and sat beside him. The 7th chair remained empty. Carlton had set it for Gerald Cole. He had sent an invitation through Edwin's firm on legal letterhead, requesting Gerald's presence to discuss a matter of mutual interest on Broughton Street. Gerald had not replied. The empty chair was not an oversight. It was a statement. We ordered. The food came. I do not remember what I ate, because by then my hands were folded on the table and my attention was fixed on the rhythm of the room, the way it fixes on the rhythm of a movement when I am about to identify the fault. Carlton let the plates be cleared. He let the coffee arrive. Then he removed his reading glasses from his breast pocket, put them on, and opened a leather folder. I want to thank everyone for coming, he said. What I am about to present is not an accusation. It is a record. He began with the map. Maria opened her laptop and turned the screen toward the center of the table. The map showed 14 parcels on Broughton Street's eastern corridor, 9 of them highlighted in red, each labeled with the LLC that had acquired it and the date of transfer. The 10th parcel, highlighted in blue, was mine. Carlton traced the chain of ownership from each LLC to its registered agent, from each agent to Cole Southern Development, and from Cole Southern Development to Gerald Allen Cole. He did this slowly, precisely, the way I would disassemble a movement one bridge at a time, one screw at a time, each piece placed on the tray in the order it would need to be reassembled. Nathan stared at the screen. His face did not change, but his hands, which had been resting on the table, moved to his lap. I noted the gesture. A man who hides his hands is a man whose body has understood something his mind has not yet accepted. Carlton opened the second section of the folder. He placed 3 photographs on the table. Gerald Cole at the 2013 Brunswick property hearing, Gerald Cole at a Savannah zoning meeting in 2019, and Gerald Cole at the Savannah Architecture Forum in March 2022. The same conference where Vanessa had been a panelist and Nathan had appeared on the attendee list. Beside the photographs, Carlton placed the printout from the health insurance portal, showing that someone had accessed my cardiology file on the 3rd of September 2023 through a staff login at a clinic in Pooler. Vanessa's phone, which had been resting screen down on the table, disappeared into her coat pocket. She did not look at Nathan. She looked at Carlton. And for the first time since I had known her, her smile was absent. Then Carlton did what I had asked him to do 3 weeks earlier, on the night I called him from the shop after Vanessa left with her portfolio. He read Lorraine's letter. He read it in full, in his measured baritone, the same voice that had addressed federal juries for 16 years. He read the date, the 12th of November 2016. He read the name, Gerald Cole. He read the warning: if our son brings someone home whose questions feel like measurements, listen to what she asks before you listen to what she says. And he read the closing: the watch keeps time. Let it keep this too. The room was silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of my own wristwatch, a 1960s Omega Seamaster I had worn every day since Lorraine gave it to me on our 25th anniversary. It ticked the way it always ticked, steady, indifferent to the weight of the moment, faithful to its own internal rhythm. Nathan looked at me. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set, and I recognized in his face the same expression Lorraine had worn the afternoon she discovered the hidden compartment in the Patek Philippe. Not shock, not anger, but the quiet rearrangement of everything a person believed to be true. "Dad," he said. "How long have you known?" "Since the camera," I said. "But your mother knew before any of us." The table held its silence for 11 seconds. I counted them because counting is what I do when the world moves faster than I can speak. 11 seconds is long enough for a balance wheel to complete 238 oscillations inside a Patek Philippe, long enough for a man to decide whether he will defend the woman beside him or let the truth have its full weight. Nathan did neither. He placed both hands flat on the table, the way an architect places his palms on a blueprint before committing to a revision, and he spoke. "Last October," he said, "in Cartagena, he told us he had taken the Charleston consulting trip Vanessa had mentioned at Thanksgiving. But the project included a site visit to Cartagena, Colombia, where the firm was advising on the restoration of a colonial-era customs house. On the second evening, alone in his hotel room overlooking the harbor, his phone rang. The caller was a man who introduced himself as Raymond Voss, a development coordinator for Harborline Holdings. Voss said he understood Nathan's father owned a commercial property on Broughton Street in Savannah and that Harborline was assembling an investment package for the corridor. He asked whether Nathan would be willing to discuss the property's future over dinner. Nathan said no. He said his father's shop was not for sale. Voss thanked him and hung up. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. Nathan deleted it from his phone log the way you delete a wrong number, without suspicion, without thought, and went to bed. But I remembered the name, Nathan said. Harborline. And when Vanessa brought the portfolio to the shop last month, I saw it on the first page. I did not say anything, because I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself my wife would not be part of something like that. I told myself a lot of things, Dad, and every single one of them was a lie I chose to believe, because the alternative was worse. He stopped. His hands were still flat on the table. His wedding ring caught the light from the chandelier and threw a thin line of gold across the white tablecloth, a line that pointed, by accident or by the geometry of the room, directly at Vanessa. Vanessa had not moved since Carlton read the letter. She sat with her back straight, her coat folded on her lap, her eyes fixed on a point above Carlton's head, where the wallpaper met the crown molding. She did not cry. She did not protest. She held herself the way a clock holds its hands at midnight, both arms pointing upward, perfectly aligned, revealing nothing about the hours that came before. Carlton placed 2 documents in front of her. The first was a cease and desist letter, addressed to Harborline Holdings, Cole Southern Development, and Vanessa Cole individually, demanding the immediate suspension of all acquisition activities related to the Broughton Street corridor, and citing violations of Georgia's Unfair Business Practices Act. The second was a formal complaint prepared for submission to the Georgia Attorney General's office, referencing the HIPAA breach, the pattern of LLC acquisitions across 4 cities, and the 2013 federal investigation file that had been partially unsealed through Maria's Freedom of Information request. "You have 48 hours to respond through counsel," Carlton said. After that, both documents are filed. The IRS referral is already in process. Vanessa looked at the documents but did not touch them. She looked at Carlton, then at Maria, then at Edwin Marsh, who had not spoken all evening, but whose presence at the table carried the weight of every number he had traced, from Harborline's accounts to Gerald Cole's personal holdings. Then she looked at Nathan. Nathan did not look back. He was staring at the empty 7th chair, the one Carlton had set for Gerald Cole, the one that had remained vacant all evening like a rest in a musical score. Not silence, but a deliberate withholding of sound. His jaw was tight. His eyes were dry now. Whatever grief had been in them when he first heard the letter had been replaced by something harder, something I recognized because I had watched it form in my own reflection over the past 18 months. The quiet, unforgiving clarity of a man who finally understands that the person he trusted most had been assembled, piece by piece, to take apart everything he loved. "Nathan," Vanessa said. Her voice was low, controlled, but stripped of its usual warmth, the way a movement is stripped of its bridges during a full-service functional parts exposed, decorative parts removed, the whole thing suddenly smaller than it appeared when it was whole. Nathan raised his hand, not sharply, not in anger, but with the slow deliberateness of a man setting down a tool he will not pick up again. "Don't," he said. Vanessa closed her mouth. She picked up her coat, her phone, and the leather portfolio that still sat on the table beside the untouched documents. She stood, pushed her chair in with both hands, and walked to the door. She did not look at me. She did not look at Carlton or Maria or Edwin. She paused at the threshold the way a pendulum pauses at the top of its arc, motionless for a fraction of a second, held by nothing but the memory of the force that brought it there, and then she was gone. The room was quiet. Carlton removed his glasses. Maria closed her laptop. Edwin slid his papers into a briefcase. These were the small, precise, mechanical sounds of people returning to their default positions after a mechanism has completed its cycle. Nathan stood and walked to my chair. He placed his hand on my shoulder, the way I had placed mine on his in the kitchen on Thanksgiving night. He held it there while the Spanish moss swayed beyond the window and the city moved on without us. The weeks after the dinner at the old pink house moved the way the hands of a damaged clock move in stutters, in pauses, in small corrections that never quite restored the rhythm to what it had been. Carlton filed both documents on the Monday following the 40-yo deadline. Vanessa's attorney, a corporate litigator from a firm in Atlanta, responded with a letter requesting an extension. Carlton denied it. By the end of April, the Georgia Attorney General's office had opened a preliminary investigation into Cole Southern Development, Harborline Holdings, and their affiliated LLCs across 4 cities. Gerald Cole did not go quietly. His own attorneys filed motions to dismiss, challenged the admissibility of the HIPAA evidence, and argued that the 2013 investigation had been closed without charges and therefore carried no legal weight. Carlton had anticipated each of these moves, the way a watchmaker anticipates the recoil in an anchor escapement, not as a surprise, but as a predictable consequence of the mechanism's design. He countered with Edwin Marsh's forensic accounting report, which traced 17 wire transfers totaling $4.6 million from Harborline's operating account to a personal trust held in Gerald Cole's name at a bank in Wilmington, Delaware. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division, already reviewing Carlton's referral, requested the full report. In June, a federal grand jury in the Southern District of Georgia returned a 12-count indictment against Gerald Allen Cole on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and tax evasion. Vanessa Cole was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. The Broughton Street project was suspended by court order, pending the outcome of the trial. The 9 parcels Gerald had already acquired remained in legal limbo, their LLCs frozen, their registered agents unreachable, their futures as uncertain as the buildings themselves. Nathan filed for divorce on a Wednesday in late May. He came to the shop that morning before the courthouse opened, sat on the stool across the repair bench, and drank the coffee I poured for him without speaking for a long time. He was wearing the brown sport coat from the dinner and a pair of shoes that needed resoling, and he looked 10 years older than he had looked 6 weeks ago. Grief does that. Not the grief of loss, which hollows a person slowly the way water hollows stone, but the grief of betrayal, which removes the floor from beneath you in a single motion and leaves you standing on nothing. I keep thinking about what Mom wrote, he said. She saw it before I did. She saw it before any of us. And she put it in a watch, because she knew you would find it when it mattered. He turned his coffee cup in his hands the way I turn a case back when I am looking for the seam. How did she know, Dad? I told him the truth, which was the only thing I had left to give him. I told him his mother had spent 24 years teaching children to read music, and that a woman who reads music learns to see the silences between notes as clearly as the notes themselves. She saw the pattern in Gerald Cole's acquisitions, the way she saw a rest in a score, not as an absence, but as a presence that had chosen not to announce itself. She understood that the most dangerous things in the world are not the ones that make noise, but the ones that wait. Nathan nodded. He finished his coffee, set the cup on the bench, and stood. He buttoned his coat with both hands, a gesture so like his mother that I had to look away. I will be back after the courthouse, he said. And he was. The divorce was finalized in August. Vanessa did not contest it. She returned to her grandfather's house on the south side of the city and did not appear in public for the remainder of the summer. Nathan moved into the apartment above the shop, the same 2 rooms where I had lived during the first year of the business in 1986, before Lorraine insisted we find a proper house. The rooms were small, the ceiling low, the plumbing unreliable, but Nathan said the sound of the grandfather clock ticking through the floorboards helped him sleep, and I did not press him for a better reason. Pearl came to see me on a Saturday in early July. She brought a jar of the fig preserves her sister made every summer in Thunderbolt and a small cardboard box tied with kitchen string. Inside the box was a handy-stitched leather case for watchmaker's loops, made by her granddaughter Jasmine, who was 15 and had been learning leatherwork at the community center on Montgomery Street. The stitching was uneven in places, but the proportions were correct, and the leather had been cut with the kind of care that comes not from skill but from intention. I should have come to you sooner, she said. The same words she had spoken in November when she confessed about Vanessa's questions. But this time the words carried a different weight. In November they had been an apology for delay. Now they were an apology for doubt for the weeks she had spent wondering whether she had done enough, whether her silence had cost me something that could not be recovered. I told her what I had told her before. You told me when it mattered. That is enough. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and picked up her tea. We sat in the quiet of the shop while I showed her the loop case Jasmine had made, and Pearl smiled for the first time in weeks. Jasmine had been recovering that spring from a respiratory illness that kept her from school for weeks. The leather work was her therapy, her way of making something whole while her body repaired itself. I understood that. A watchmaker always does. Nathan asked me to teach him how to open a watch on a Sunday morning in September, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and 4 days after he had walked into the shop at 7 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee from Bull Street, and said, without preamble, "I want to understand what you do." I did not ask what had changed. A watchmaker does not ask a clock why it has started running again. He simply winds it and listens. I gave him the same flat-blade screwdriver I had given Lorraine 9 years earlier, number 3. Swiss-made. Rosewood handle worn smooth at the thumb. I placed the 1928 Ansonia mantel clock on the bench between us because it was forgiving and sturdy, and because a man learning to work with his hands should begin with something that will not punish his mistakes. I showed him how to hold the blade at a 15-degree angle, how to apply pressure with the heel of the palm rather than the fingers, how to listen for the small release that tells you the case back has surrendered. He tried 3 times. The first attempt was too cautious, the blade barely touching the seam. The second was too forceful, the kind of overcorrection that comes from impatience. The third was right. The caseback lifted with a click that filled the shop the way a single note fills a concert hall when the musician has found the exact center of the pitch. Nathan held the open clock in both hands and looked at the movement inside the gears, the bridges, the mainspring coiled in its barrel, and I watched his face change the way Lorraine's face had changed, the first time she saw the interior of the Patek Philippe. "It is beautiful," he said. "It is honest," I said. "A watch has no opinion. It does not care who winds it or why. It only knows how to keep time, and it does so until it cannot. And then it waits for someone to repair it. That is all any of us can do." He set the Ansonia down and looked at the Patek Philippe on its velvet tray. He had not touched it since the night at the old pink house. None of us had. It sat where it always sat. Its case back closed again. Its movement unwound. Its secret compartment empty now that Lorraine's letter lived in the shop safe. But the watch still carried something, not a message, not a warning, but the memory of every hand that had held it since 1948, from Reverend Whitfield to Eleanor to Lorraine to me. "Can I?" Nathan asked, gesturing toward the Patek. I nodded. He picked it up with both hands, the way you pick up something that is heavier than its weight. He turned it over, studied the case back, and positioned the screwdriver at the seam. This time he did not hesitate. The blade found the angle on the first try. The case back opened with the same quiet click it had made every time since 1948, a sound so small and so precise that it belonged not to the watch, but to the silence around it. He looked at the movement, at the empty compartment where the letter had been. Then he looked at me. "What do we put in there now?" he asked. I thought about that question for a long time. The grandfather clock ticked behind us. The morning light came through the front window and fell across the bench in the same pattern it had followed for 30-on-9 years. The same angle, the same warmth, indifferent to everything that had changed inside the room. I thought about Lorraine writing her letter at the hallway desk in November 2016, folding it twice, pressing it flat, sliding it beneath the brass panel. I thought about Reverend Whitfield winding the watch every Sunday before church, his hands steady, his faith in the mechanism as absolute as his faith in the hymns. I thought about Gerald Cole assembling his parcels one by one, building a machine designed to take, and about Lorraine assembling her evidence one page at a time, building a defense designed to protect. "Nothing," I said. "We leave it empty. A watch does not need to carry secrets to have value. It only needs to run." Nathan closed the case back. He set the Patek Philippe on the velvet tray, positioning it in the center with the same care I had used for years. Then he reached for the winding crown and looked at me. "May I?" he asked. Wind it slowly, I said. A quarter turn at a time. You will feel the mainspring engage. When it catches, stop. That is enough tension to start the balance wheel. The rest will come on its own. He wound it. A quarter turn, then another, then a third. On the fourth turn, I heard the faint, precise vibration of a mainspring engaging a barrel for the first time in nearly 8 years. The balance wheel began to oscillate. The gear train moved. The hands, frozen since October 2016, shifted forward by 1 second. Then another. Then another. Each tick as quiet and deliberate as a heartbeat resuming after a long silence. Nathan set the watch down and stepped back. He stood in the morning light with his hands at his sides, listening, the way his mother had listened. The first afternoon she held that watch to her ear and heard its mechanism for the first time. The Patek Philippe ticked on the velvet tray between us, keeping time to nothing and everything, measuring no appointment, serving no deadline, simply running because that is what a watch does when someone cares enough to wind it. I lit the candle. The flame caught the gold of the case and held it. Outside, Broughton Street was waking, and every clock in my shop was running.